What's up, guys? I'm Justin Burkholz. Thank you for watching. Today I've got another book review for you, this time of the book The 1 Year Manual by Dr. Israel Regardie. And this is one of my all-time favorite books, so I'm super excited to get into this. But before we get to the good stuff, if you're interested in mysticism, history of religion, spiritual practices, or science-based protocols for improving longevity, health, and wellness, and want to support my effort to bring this content in an accessible format to a wide audience for free here on YouTube, please hit subscribe, the like button, and consider supporting me on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Those links can be found below. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the 1 Year Manual by Dr. Israel Regardie, previously titled 12 Steps to Spiritual Enlightenment. So there is another edition of this book that exists out there. This is technically the second edition, and it is revised. It is a little bit different than the first version. So if you find a copy that's still titled 12 Steps to Spiritual Enlightenment, that will be the original edition of the book. He did go back in a few years after the original publication and make some changes, of which he talks about in the preface of this edition. So I recommend going with this one. I think the changes he made are good. So definitely look for the 1 Year Manual. You can find this on Amazon or other stores. It's usually around $10. It's a very cheap and inexpensive book, and it's very short as well. You'll see a very thin book here. It's about 70 pages. I think it's exactly 70 pages actually in total, and somehow he manages to write one of the most amazing books I've ever read in those few short pages. So I do want to talk about what exactly is included in this beautiful little book. So in my latest blog post, you may have seen, or maybe not, I'll have a link for you in the description below, I talked about reverse engineering enlightenment. And this was based on the work of cognitive science professor John Vervaeke from the University of Toronto and his amazing lecture series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. There's definitely going to be a link to that as well below. Check that out. If you haven't heard of John, and if you haven't seen Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, I consider it to be the absolute pinnacle of content on YouTube. I don't know of any other single piece of content on YouTube that I feel is as valuable. Now, it is a 50-part lecture series. Each part is about an hour long. So it's very long in total, but it's the kind of thing, like for me, I took a few months, I think 3 or 4 months, to kind of watch through the whole series, and it is definitely worth it. So go check that out if you haven't already. Go read my blog post if you are interested. But basically, John describes a process of reverse engineering enlightenment as one of creating an ecology of practices that work together in a dynamical fashion to counteract the ways that we can be prone to self-deception and kind of self-destructive behavior, and can counteract all of the ways that our adaptive intelligence can actually work against us. He details all of that from a very rigorous cognitive science perspective, and I briefly cover all of the different perennial problems, as they're called, in my post as well. But essentially, it's about creating an ecology of practices that work together to provide us with maximum clarity, to remind us of our ideal and help us align internally and be able to make the best decisions by avoiding the ways that we can be prone to self-deception. But many, many years before John was teaching, I don't know, probably not before he was born, but a very long time ago, Dr. Israel Regardie had the same exact thought and came to the same conclusion as far as how do we cultivate enlightenment. And so he put that together near the end of his life. He put together this book, which presents, it's essentially 13 practices that comprise an ecology of practices that should be sufficient to get anyone very far down the path towards cultivating wisdom or enlightenment. Now, I do want to mention that even though the book is called the 1-Year Manual, it is not necessarily the case that every student will be able to complete the procedures and the practices involved here and master all of them, I guess I should say, within 1 year. It might be possible for maybe the absolute best ideal student, if such a person were to exist, but Israel is very aware that such a person probably doesn't exist. There probably is no ideal student, and that because of everyone's unique personalities and skill sets and knowledge base, etc., everyone will go through the process at a different rate. So in his own words, he states, "It must be self-evident that though designed for a 12-month period, it is more likely that the student may need to spend a good 5 years working with these simple methods. Some exercises may be completed and mastered in the month prescribed. Other procedures may require anywhere from 3 months to a year before any real mastery or noticeable result is achieved. It is important, therefore, to stress patience as a supreme necessity where this course of study is concerned. Some exercises have as a secondary gain the acquisition of a higher degree of patience." So you can see from that though he does call it the 1-Year Manual, it very well might take you many more than 1 year to go through it all and master each of the practices. In fact, I've had this for about 3 years now, and I would not say that I have mastered all of the practices in it. I have mastered most. But there are 13 practices and rituals involved, and some of them do take a very long time and a lot of practice and effort before you really get the hang of it, especially towards the end of the book when he presents some fairly complex rituals. But you work your way up. So it's laid out in a very linear fashion, and each chapter covers a specific practice, tells you how to implement that practice, how to practice it, how long you might need to do it before moving on to the next, etc. And each one builds certain skills and techniques that build upon the last practice, so that by the end, when you're doing the longer rituals and ceremonies, you've built up a set of skills, you've built up the willpower and the discipline and the visualization, etc., to be able to do those more complex rituals more easily. That was certainly the case for me. And I talk about this on my blog in my post on the Rose Cross ritual, which I actually adapted from his version for the version that I created on my website, and I talk about the kind of skills that you build as you go through his process here in that post as well. Going to go through and talk about the specific practices and rituals that are introduced throughout the 1-Year Manual here. But before I do that, I just want to make one more point about one of the other reasons I really like this book so much. One of the other things that John Vervaeke talks about is that there are actually multiple kinds of knowledge, and we've gotten into a place culturally where we have devalued most kinds of knowledge, all of them basically except for propositional knowledge, which is kind of argumentative statements, facts of knowledge. But there is procedural knowledge, which is the knowledge of how to actually do something. There is participatory and perspectival knowledge as well. And so one of the things John states is that ritual and religion and spiritual practices engage those other kinds of knowing, And that's how we actually cultivate wisdom and meaning in our life. We can't really cultivate meaning in life from acquiring facts and statements. That's not how we cultivate real meaning, and it's not what's going to transform us internally either. And Israel Regardie was also well aware of this, and even in his language in the intro, you can see this. So I wanted to read another quick quotation here for you, just kind of showing exactly what I'm talking about here. And you'll notice his language. He uses the words procedure and practice many times. Even in fact, in the previous quote that I shared, he used the same procedural language. So here's the quote here. It says, "The occult student at the outset of his studies is besieged by hundreds of books describing dozens of practices of every kind. They promise, directly or otherwise, to bring him to the very heights of spiritual attainment, no matter how that attainment is defined. But by the very wealth of material is he overwhelmed. And the result is that, generally speaking, he does nothing except read. Reading does very little to bring one to any kind of realization of one's divine nature. In this manual, it is proposed to burden the student with very little theory, but to outline a course of procedure, which, persisted in for at least 12 months, will bring him a good way along the path. This course of procedure will describe a certain number of classical practices which are calculated to produce certain types of results. There will be no attempt to dazzle him with startling but vague promises, with fantasies of great achievements, with misleading claims leading nowhere." Now, I find that incredibly refreshing as someone who comes from a very scientific, rationally minded perspective and worldview. I have very little patience for those kind of startling but vague promises, the fantasies of great achievements, etc. And there's a lot of that within this space. If you go to any kind of conference on mysticism, mindfulness, magic, the occult, psychic, whatever, you find almost only all of that he just said that he's leaving out. You find very little meat and a lot of sparkle and dazzle and very little substance underneath. And one of the things that I want to change is to reverse that and go back to a style of teaching more like Israel Regardie. So like I mentioned before, even though the book is called 12 Steps to Spiritual Enlightenment, it actually includes 13 practices. Now, here's the contents, table of contents page for you. Hopefully you can read that there. And you'll see that the very first chapter after the preface says the 4 adorations. Now, the reason that there are 13 practices when it's only supposed to be these 12 steps is that those 4 adorations, those are solar adorations. That practice is meant to be done every day from when you start the book to after you finish the whole process, if that ever happens. So it's meant to just be a daily practice that you do forever. Whereas all of the other 12 are step by step, in a linear fashion, like I said, building certain skills and then moving on to the next practice. That one is treated differently. So it definitely inspired my own solar invocation or morning ritual that I talk about in my first book and on my blog. And it's just a practice of turning to the sun at certain times of day to repeat these little adorations, little prayers to the sun. And that has a number of effects as far as in training you to solar rhythms and in training your circadian rhythm. And it also changes your relationship with the sun. And I talk a lot about why a solar adoration process is beneficial on my other posts. So the next step after that, going back to our table of contents here, where did that go? He teaches a body awareness practice, a relaxation technique, a rhythmic breathing technique, a mental awareness practice. So the first 4 steps in his 12 steps are body and mind awareness, a relaxation technique, and rhythmic breathing. So all of that is stuff that I also tell people to focus on whenever they start any kind of spiritual practice as well. I usually tell people to focus on a relaxation technique like the physiological sigh that I teach, a rhythmic breathing practice like cyclic hyperventilation or box breathing, something like that. Body awareness is like a body scan type thing, and then mental awareness as well is like a mindfulness type practice. So you can see how you're starting to develop awareness there and developing some certain skills so that you can shift your state of consciousness. So you're developing awareness and tools to shift your body and mind state in the first 4 parts. The 5th one says concentration or use of the mantra. So that practice involves developing our ability to focus, concentrate. The next step is developing the will, so developing discipline and willpower. And then after you've developed all of those skills, he moves into the more complex rituals. Once again, hopefully you can read that there. That involves the Rose Cross ritual, which I mentioned earlier, and I teach on my blog as well, my own version. The Middle Pillar ritual, which he actually wrote an entire book about that is phenomenal, called The Middle Pillar. Highly recommend that as well, by Israel Regardie. And then what were the last ones? Oh, symbol of devotion. So this is kind of like a talismanic magical practice. Practice of the presence of God. A unifying practice, or unitive practice. He titles Unity, All is God. And then the last chapter is titled Invoke Often, Inflame Thyself with Prayer. And this is something he took from Eliphas Levi, a famous magician from Europe. And he talks about how to use prayer to enter altered states of consciousness, to essentially he talks about how to use prayer as a unitive practice. So it's a very powerful teaching on prayer, and you really have to develop all of the previous skills in order to get to that point. But then, it's very, very interesting, and he actually provides some specific prayers as well for you to use, or guides you on how to write your own. So all in all, it's an incredible path to developing a lot of really important skills, a lot of mental and body awareness, and even some really amazing and powerful rituals as well. So once again, I think the 1 Year Manual is one of the best books ever written on spiritual practice, and it's really great because it is just right to the point. It's very succinct. It just presents the practices themselves, and that allows you to just engage with the process. And if you want to learn more of the theory and the physiology and all of that kind of stuff, you can pick up his other books. You can go check out John's series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. You can read my blog or other books on the philosophy and the science of why all of these things work. But this just gives you a complete set of instructions that you could honestly work through for the rest of your life, and it would continue to cultivate wisdom and add meaning to your life. So if you're interested in magic, mysticism, spiritual practices, or personal development, and are looking to start with something short but also comprehensive, it doesn't get any better than this. Seriously, it's really remarkable book. It's almost unbelievable that a book which is only 70 pages long can provide a comprehensive path to enlightenment, but somehow it does. So, if you're interested in picking up a copy, I'll have a link in the description for you. If you like my video, please hit the like button for me. Subscribe if you haven't already. And like I said, consider supporting me on Patreon or picking up one of my books below. I just published my first book, Luna, which is another collection of some really powerfully transformative rituals and spiritual practices. The 1-year enlightenment would be perfect preparation to dive into something more complex like this, but it's not necessary. I'll introduce this relevant skills and techniques along the way in Luna as well. So if you're interested in picking that up, there's definitely going to be a link below for you. And once again, thank you for watching, and a huge thank you to my patrons. Your support is greatly appreciated. I couldn't do this without you. So I hope you all enjoyed the video. Have a good day.